Hi guys, we're going to talk about chapter 21, and this is going to talk about conflict resolution and negotiation. So this chapter is going to just present an overview of growth producing versus dysfunctional conflict in organizations. We'll discuss the history of conflict management, categories of conflict, the conflict process itself, and strategies for successful conflict resolution. Incivility, workplace violence, bullying, and mobbing are all presented as threats to patient and worker safety, and strategies for eliminating workplace violence are suggested. We'll conclude with this chapter with a discussion of negotiations as a conflict resolution strategy. So let's get started here. Conflict is generally defined as the internal or external discord that occurs as a result of differences in ideas, values, or beliefs of two or more people. Conflict is natural, neither positive nor negative. We know that conflict is a natural and expected outcome when managers are dealing with people that have a variety of different values, beliefs, backgrounds, and goals. Conflict is also created when there are differences in economic and professional values, and when there is competition among professionals. Some level of conflict in an organization appears desirable, although the optimum level for a specific person or unit at a given time is difficult to determine. When organizational conflict becomes dysfunctional, the manager must recognize it early and actively intervene so that subordinates' motivation and organization productivity are not adversely affected. Conflict is neither good nor bad, and it can produce growth or destruction depending on how it is managed. Some level of conflict in an organization does appear desirable, although again, right, the optimum level of a unit, a person, is really hard to see. So you can see the differences there on just that little meme. So in the early 20th century, conflict was considered to be an indication of poor organizational management. It was deemed destructive and was avoided at all costs. When conflict occurred, it was ignored, it was denied, or dealt with harshly and immediately. We get to the mid-20th century, and organizations recognized that satisfaction and feedback are important to employees, and conflict was accepted passively and perceived as normal and expected. Too little conflict results in organizational stasis. Too much reduces that organization's effectiveness and eventually immobilizes those employees. Currently, conflict is viewed as neither good nor bad, again, because of that growth, that production of growth, or the ability to just be destructive. Some common sources of organizational conflict include scarce resources. We don't have enough resources to hand out or have available for us. It could cause some conflict. Maybe restructuring of the organization. That's going to definitely cause some conflict. If our roles are not defined properly, our expectations are not defined, that can cause some conflict. Communication is huge, right? If we have communication problems, it's going to cause some conflict. Organizational structure, even individual behavior. Remembering we're not going to get along with everybody. We're going to have those people that we just have conflict with. So sometimes behavior can come into play. The responsibility for determining and creating appropriate levels of conflict falls on that leader-manager. Leader-managers must choose their battles carefully. The manager that brings up only the most important issues will develop credibility. The manager that makes an issue about everything will be labeled a complainer, and then when a legitimate concern comes up, it's going to be ignored, just like that fable of the boy who cried wolf. So what are some categories of conflict? We can talk about intrapersonal conflict, interpersonal conflict, and intergroup conflict. So let's look at each of these. When we think about intrapersonal conflict, this occurs within the person. There's internal struggles with values and wants. So for managers, intrapersonal conflict may result from the multiple areas of responsibility associated with that management role. Being self-aware, conscientious worker to resolve those interpersonal conflicts as soon as it is felt is really essential. Some examples might occur when you're struggling between what you want to do and what you actually should do. Interpersonal conflict happens when two or more people with differing values, goals, and beliefs. It may be closely linked with bullying, incivility, and mobbing. People-focused conflicts are based on emotions and feelings and are more representative of a personal attack. Communication is not always received or may be interpreted incorrectly. So some examples may include married couples fighting over finance, two employees fighting over a promotion. Intergroup conflict occurs between two or more groups of people, departments, or organizations. These disagreements could exist formally or informally. There's usually confusion regarding whether it's the responsibility of nursing or housekeeping to make the bed in a patient room following cleaning up. That's an example of intergroup conflict, right? The nursing group and the housekeeping group are having this dispute. Before managers can attempt to intervene in conflict, they must be able to assess the 5 stages of conflict resolution. The first stage is latent conflict. These precede the conflict behavior. So conflict in this stage is ripe, although no conflict has actually occurred, and it may never occur. We know that change and budget cuts almost invariably create a conflict, and intervention should be well thought out so that when that conflict happens, we've assessed it before it escalates. That's our latent conflict. If the conflict progresses, it enters that second stage of perceived conflict, meaning intellectualized conflict that often involves issues and roles. Sometimes individuals can resolve the conflict at this stage before it's internalized or felt. When the conflict is emotionalized, we enter stage 3, or that felt conflict. These felt emotions may be hostile, fear, mistrust, or even anger. The person can feel the conflict, but may not be able to perceive the problem. In the 4th stage, manifest conflict or overt conflict, action is taken. Action may be withdrawal, competition, debate, or seeking conflict resolution. And then that final stage is conflict aftermath. The conflict aftermath can be a positive or negative. If it's managed well, there will be a positive outcome. If it's managed poorly, the conflict issue will remain and may return to cause more conflict. So what are some of our learned responses that manifest during conflict? People often learn patterns of dealing with conflict early in their lives. Family background, experiences often directly affect how we deal with conflict as an adult. I think if you can think about how do you deal with conflict now, and you can think back to your childhood, did that family background, those life experiences, directly navigate how you deal with the conflict as an adult now? Conflict resolution outcomes can be seen as win-win, win-lose, and lose-lose. Clearly, our optimal goal is to create a win-win solution for everyone, but that may not be possible for every situation. 6 common conflict management strategies that are identified are compromising, competing, cooperating or accommodating, smoothing, avoiding, and collaborating. The choice of the most appropriate strategy really depends on many variables, including the situation, the urgency of the decision, the power and status of the players involved, the importance of the issue, and the maturity of the people involved. So let's look at each of these strategies a little bit closer. In compromising, each party gives up something it wants. So for compromising not to result in a lose-lose situation, both parties must be willing to give up something of equal value. It's important that parties in conflict do not adopt compromise prematurely if collaboration is both possible and feasible. Competing is a type of conflict resolution used when one party pursues what it wants, regardless of the cost to anybody else. Because only one party typically wins, this is considered a win-lose conflict resolution that leaves the loser angry, frustrated, and wanting to get even. Cooperating is a type of conflict resolution where one party sacrifices his or her beliefs and wants to allow the other party to win. So this is also a win-lose situation because the actual problem is usually not resolved, right? We're just putting a band-aid on the concern. Employees who use accommodation or cooperating as a primary conflict management resolution strategy often develop resentment. Smoothing is a conflict resolution where an effort is made to reduce the emotional component of the conflict, but not to solve the conflict. Managers often use smoothing to get someone to accommodate or cooperate with another party. Smoothing rarely results in resolution of the actual conflict. Avoiding is a conflict resolution strategy in which the parties involved are aware of the conflict but choose not to acknowledge it or even attempt to resolve it. Those that actively avoid conflict frequently have low self-esteem or hold a position of very low power. The biggest concern in using avoidance is that the conflict remains, often only to reemerge at a later time, even in an even more exaggerated fashion. Collaborating is an assertive and cooperative means of conflict resolution where all parties set aside their original goals and they work together to establish a common priority goal. So all parties are putting aside their wants to try to come up with a common goal. Collaboration will not happen if people cannot set aside original goals. This is a conflict resolution strategy that results in a win-win solution if it works. Although conflict is a pervasive force in healthcare organization, only a small percentage of time is spent in true collaboration. The impact of power on collaboration, we can see here is that collaboration is rare when there's a wide difference in power. In collaboration, problem solving is a joint effort with no superior subordinate. Order giving, order taking relationship. We're all on the same level, collaborating jointly to solve a problem. True collaboration requires mutual respect, open and honest communication, and equitable shared decision-making powers. So what are some common causes of organizational conflict? Managing conflict effectively requires an understanding of its origin. Was poor communication occurring? Was there an inadequate defined organizational structure that was confusing? Was it an individual behavior? Were there unclear expectations, individual or group conflicts of interest, operational or staffing changes, or diversity in gender, culture, or age? Organizational conflicts can disrupt working relationships, generate a breakdown in trust, and lower productivity. It is imperative that the manager identify the origin of the conflict and intervene early to promote cooperation and collaborative conflict resolution. Some helpful tips for managers in conflict resolution include focusing on the cause of the disagreement, right? Getting to the root of it. Try to arrive at solutions that are acceptable for everyone concerned, getting all of the information, and then being able to differentiate between facts and opinions. Making sure that you're listening carefully, not judging. Do not belabor how the conflict occurred. Instead, try to concentrate on what should be done to keep it from occurring again. And then concentrate on understanding and not on trying to agree. Sometimes conflict escalates to harmful and even dangerous conduct. Bullying is defined as repeated, offensive, abusive, intimidating, or insulting behaviors. It could be an abuse of power, unfair sanctions that make recipients feel humiliated, vulnerable, or even threatened, thus creating stress and undermining their self-confidence. Horizontal bullying is bullying that occurs between coworkers. Unfortunately, this has become a serious issue within the nursing profession. Incivility is a behavior that lacks authentic respect for others. Incivility can be seen on a continuum with disruptive behaviors such as eye rolling, with other nonverbal behaviors and sarcastic comments. Mobbing is when employees gang up on an individual. The degree of harm from either bullying or mobbing often depends on how frequently it's occurring, what's the intensity, and the duration. So when we consider workplace violence, we've talked about bullying, incivility, and mobbing, right? These are all violences that we can see in the workplace. It can impact our physical, emotional, and social economic health of employees, and it really threatens the safety of our patients. Violence against health workers is a problem really worldwide. So don't think you're going to get into a facility and not experience this at some point. The healthcare industry leads all other sectors for non-fatal workplace assaults. In all honesty, I don't know. I mean, I've seen some bullying within coworkers. I've seen some incivility, but it's that patient healthcare provider is where a lot of this workplace violence comes into play. And unfortunately, it has increased dramatically since the pandemic. So what are some of the consequences of workplace violence? Right, we're just exposed more often, and post-traumatic stress disorder could become an issue. Anxiety, depression, and burnout are definitely an issue after exposure. Medical consequences including health complaints, neck pain, musculoskeletal complaints, acute pain, fibromyalgia, and even cardiovascular symptoms. We can think about emotional, psychological consequences, mental distress, sleep disturbances, fatigue, depression, anxiety, adjustment disorders, absenteeism, turnover, could even lead to increased risk of suicide. I think as we were watching the news during the pandemic, right, how many healthcare providers left completely the healthcare system, and how many of them actually took their life because of suicide. The quality of care provided by an affected nurse often decreases significantly. Most facilities, in fact, probably all organizations, should have a bullying policy in place with zero tolerance as that expectation. And that includes patients to healthcare providers as well. So let's talk a little bit about negotiation. Negotiation frequently resembles compromise when we use it as a conflict negotiation strategy. The emphasis is on accommodating the differences between the parties. It's a psychological and verbal. An effective negotiator always looks calm and self-assured. Negotiation in its most creative form is similar to collaboration when used correctly, but it could resemble competing approach if managed poorly. Negotiation frequently resembles compromise when it's used as a conflict resolution. Each party is giving up something, and the emphasis is on accommodating differences between those parties. Because negotiators must be willing to make compromise, starting at a point that is high and on the upper limits of expectations should be chosen, knowing that they may need to come down to a more realistic goal. The very least for which a person will settle is often referred to as the bottom line. The manager also needs to consider other trade-offs that are possible in these situations. When we think about trade-offs, these are secondary gains, often future-oriented, that may be realized as a result of conflict. The wise manager will consider trading something today for something tomorrow as a means to reach satisfactory negotiations. The manager also must look for and acknowledge hidden agendas. Most negotiations have a covert and an overt agenda. Managers who protest too strongly that they do not have a hidden agenda appear defensive and vulnerable. Common strategies used by leaders during negotiation to increase their persuasiveness and foster open communication are using factual statements, listening, keeping an open mind, discussing issues and not personalities, being honest, delay when confronted with something totally unexpected, right? That brings in your emotional intelligence. Never tell the other party you're willing to negotiate totally, and know the bottom line, but try not to use it. If you're in a situation where parties are getting angry or tired, take a break, take a cooling off time, and then come back. Negotiation is psychological and verbal. The effective negotiator always appears calm and self-assured. So if you look at this picture here, can you tell which one is the negotiator, right? They both look calm, they both look self-assured, but one of them is negotiating for something. Some negotiators win by using destructive negotiation tactics. These tactics may be conscious or unconscious, but are used repeatedly because they have been successful for that person. Successful managers do not use these type of tactics, but because others with whom they negotiate might do so, they must be prepared to counter such tactics. Ambiguous or inappropriate questioning, gestures of helplessness. Nursing is a profession of helping. Managers can lose sight of intent with this tactic if they're not careful. Intimidation and manipulation are the most widely used tactics. Ridicule is a type of intimidation. Flattery is used to divert the attention. And then aggressiveness or aggression. Destructive negotiation tactics are never part of collaborative conflict resolution. So just as important to start formal negotiations with pleasantries, it's also to close on a friendly note. So once a compromise has been reached, restate the final decision and what was agreed on. If managers win more negotiations than anticipated, they should hide that astonishment and still make the other party feel like they also won. It's also a good idea to follow up formal negotiations in writing by sending a letter or memo stating what was agreed. If you will learn nothing as a new nurse, write everything down. You have something to fall back on if negotiations, conflict continue. Occasionally, parties cannot reach agreements through negotiations, and in this case, alternative dispute resolution may be indicated to keep some privacy in the dispute and to avoid expensive litigation. So some of the types of the ADRs include mediation, fact-finding, due process hearings, and ombudsperson. Consensus means that negotiating parties reach an agreement that all parties can support everyone's priorities. The greatest challenge in using consensus as a conflict resolution Strategy is time. Consensus also requires good communication skills and to be open-minded and flexible. And that concludes this chapter on negotiations. If you have any questions in conflict resolution, if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email or we can chat about it in class. Thanks, guys.